For as long as I can remember, battling a Chinese accent has been a humongous part of learning English in my family. Take my sister, for example. She's 12 years older than me, and she grew up attending a local Chinese school until just before her early teens. And then she transferred to an international school. Of course, I was too young to really witness this firsthand, but one of the stories about that transition will always stick with me. When she began attending her new school, it was terribly hard for her to fit in because of her accent. Everyone around her sounded like a native, which made her stand out in an awkward way because she didn't speak English as her first language. And so the way she spoke was kind of different, and it wasn't accepted. This isn't the end of this phenomenon. My parents also have a Chinese accent, and getting rid of it is always on their list of goals. On long car rides, my mom would ask me to tell her the correct American way of pronouncing word after word, and my dad would ask me to practice speaking English with him to make sure that he was still saying things right. In my household, this accent is seen as an enemy, and that is the case with many, many people around the world too. But why is that? Why do we have a collective hatred toward accents, something that is as normal as eating or breathing? And what more can accents actually say about ourselves? To understand all of this, we need to have an idea of how accents are formed in the first place. Each language has its own unique ways of pronunciation. Some have more or less vowels, some have different consonants, some use pitch to change the meaning of a word, like Chinese, and some use the emphasis of certain syllables, like English. So when someone learns English as a second language, the unique features of their first language will be carried over. To set a very classic example, in Chinese, the th sound that we often hear in English in words like though and them is absent. Therefore, it might be hard for someone from China to pronounce this th sound because they never grew up saying it in their native language. Or for a Spanish speaker learning English, the short I sound in pit could also be difficult to say because it doesn't exist in their mother tongue. Something else that affects accents is perception, which just means how well you can hear or identify certain sounds, like the R sound and L sound, for instance. Because they are similar, it could be hard for someone who is just starting to speak English to hear the difference. And so they might accidentally pronounce a word like road as load, or vice versa. But why do accents last? Why are we unable to correct our pronunciation and just simply move on? Studies show that this could be explained by something called the critical period, which refers to a time frame in childhood, before puberty, where it's easiest to learn a new language and become familiar with all of its sounds. After this, our brains keep a library of sounds from this time, and when we learn new sounds from new languages, they are approximated from the ones that we already know, instead of being perfectly recreated. That is why, as we step closer to adulthood, it becomes harder to learn to speak English like a native. So, accents are essentially remnants of our mother tongue, or living ghosts of our first language, that linger as a sort of reminiscence between our teeth. It is something tangible that commemorates our childhoods and upbringings that remain with us even as we forget some parts of the real memory. But in many places, this is frowned upon, even though people do not have control over their accents. Accents are seen as an indication of foreignness, and people use them to try and justify that certain groups do not belong in a society. This can cause biases in educational and professional opportunities, and in more extreme circumstances, lead to individuals with accents speaking less or not speaking at all in order to avoid judgment. What's also really concerning is that these biases do not apply to everyone with accents. For example, accents like French and Italian are thought of more positively and seen as more attractive because they allude to thoughts about romantic places, while Asian accents are seen in a much more negative light, especially due to a perceived association with third world countries. Things like perceived credibility are also affected. In a study conducted in New Zealand, researchers observed that mild foreign accents, such as Chinese or Scottish, were rated less credible, whereas a mild New Zealand accent, which is native to the country, was considered more credible. Meanwhile, especially heavy accents gave different results, with them tending to have a more negative impact on perceived credibility overall. Moreover, native English speakers may perceive Asian accents as more rude sounding because of a relative lack of intonation, which is the pitch of your voice when you speak. This ultimately contributes further to the discrimination experienced by these populations. Issues like this are actually not just prevalent amongst people who speak English as a second language, because those with regional accents experience similar instances of prejudice. In the UK, the received pronunciation accent is considered the standard way of speaking and is associated with higher social status. By contrast, people with regional accents who do not speak received pronunciation are seen as not prestigious enough, and they are therefore discouraged from pursuing certain career paths because they sound less professional. Because of this discrimination and prejudice, many people will try to modify their accents in an attempt to sound more like a native English speaker, which really comes back to what my family members have aimed to achieve throughout the years. People try to adopt features from the way another group speaks to try and fit in with them, whether it is to have an advantage in professional settings or to gain more social opportunities. Online, there are even programs and lessons that guide people in reducing their accents, where they train non-native speakers to change their mouth, jaw, and tongue placement, intonation, and rhythm in order to sound more American. However, let's take a moment to think. Is this really the correct thing to do? Studies actually show that only around 7% of the world's population are native English speakers, which means that the very, very vast majority of English is spoken with accents. So, accents are natural. Like we established earlier, they exist because the sounds from our first language stick with us and leave behind an imprint on our speaking habits. Therefore, they are extremely powerful indicators of identity. When we speak with an accent, we're actually bringing with us little snippets of culture that come from our hometown to somewhere else through language. When non-native English speakers find themselves in a foreign country, these similar accents help them find community, with generations of history and common backgrounds seeping from their speech and forming into bonds in the present day. To speak personally, next year I'm going to college, and I know that when I'm walking these American streets, hearing a Chinese accent will remind me of my mother, my sister, my father, and this place where I've spent the first 17 years of my life. This accent is what brings me back here, when I'm actually thousands of miles away. So, villainizing accents and seeing them as something bad or unproductive will only increase the divide in society. At the same time, it reaps people of their sense of community. By deliberately and forcefully changing your accent to sound like you're from somewhere else, you are erasing a meaningful part of your home and lineage. But by normalizing accents, we will not only be able to better accept and promote diversity, but also foster connection. Let's think back to the example of regional accents in the UK. Accent discrimination is actually not the real end to that story. Even though people with regional accents are sometimes pushed to not enter certain professions, once they actually start working within that field, their accents become an advantage. Because the way they speak embraces a shared identity, they can establish more authentic connections with people such as clients, judges, and juries. Through rejecting the need for a standard accent, inclusion flourishes in the workplace, which allows people to interact on a much more personal level. So, what should our next steps be? We need to acknowledge that amidst the importance of correct pronunciation and grammatical accuracy, accents should be respected and appreciated, just like how we treat people's cultural upbringings and heritage. Rather than an indication of inferiority, the lack of bars in my family members' speech is a reflection of their Shanghainese backgrounds, of the way their ancestors spoke, and little pieces of the romance from their own dialect. This version of English transcends the pressures of seamless pronunciation and instead reinforces centuries of identity. Furthermore, in teaching English to non-natives, we should encourage clarity instead of emulating a certain way of speaking, consciously making sure that we aren't deliberately erasing accents. This means asking, how can I say this to get my point across? Not, how can I say this to sound identical to everyone else? And as a collective society, we need to learn to stay away from the territory of overcorrecting and discrimination. Because how can we be so sure that one certain way of talking is the correct way? After all, everyone has an accent, whether it is French or American or British or Singaporean or Australian. They are just stories of our home that we carry with us in the words that we speak. Thank you.